laughter hit Clara Bennett before the words did. It rolled across the crowded lawn like a wave meant to knock her down in front of everyone she had ever known. Daniel Whitfield stood near the drink table with a glass in his hand, grinning at her the way a man grins when he already knows he has won. "Still unwed, Clara?" he said, loud enough for 3 generations of Bennetts to hear. "At your age, most women have children pulling at their skirts. You have nothing but a job and an empty ring finger." A few people chuckled. Someone near the fence pretended to check their phone to avoid meeting her eyes. Clara felt her face grow hot, but she did not look away from him. She had spent years being the quiet one, the one who let comments slide because fighting back never seemed worth the trouble. But something in her chest cracked open that evening, and what came out was not anger. It was clarity. She set down her paper cup of lemonade on the folding table beside her, and she smiled, though the smile did not reach her eyes. "Better an empty ring finger than an empty life, Daniel," she said. The laughter around them faltered. Her Aunt Margaret, standing near the porch steps, pressed her lips together and looked away, the same way she always did whenever conflict rose in the family. She never took sides. She never stopped it either. Clara had long stopped expecting her mother to defend her, but the sting of that silence never fully faded. Daniel's grin cracked at the edges. He opened his mouth to fire back, but Clara had already turned. She did not run. She did not cry, not yet. She walked, steady and calm, past the tables of potato salad and grilled chicken, past her cousins whispering behind cupped hands, past the tire swing where she used to play as a child before life turned complicated. She walked straight to her car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel with her hands shaking on her lap. She did not start the engine right away. She looked at the house where she had grown up, at the warm yellow light spilling from the windows, at the shapes of people she loved and people who had hurt her, blurred together into one crowd she no longer wanted to belong to. That night, long after the party ended, Clara packed 2 suitcases. She did not fold her clothes with care the way she usually did. She stuffed them in, closed the zippers, and carried the bags down the stairs of her small rented apartment before the sun rose. She left a short note for her landlord about the final month's rent, and she left nothing at all for her family. No note, no explanation, no forwarding address. She got into her car just as the sky turned from black to gray, and she drove. For the first 2 hours, she cried without stopping, the kind of crying that comes from years of small hurts finally breaking loose at once. She thought about every holiday dinner where someone asked why she was still single, every wedding where relatives seated her at the table reserved for children and unmarried cousins, every birthday where her mother sighed instead of celebrating. She thought about Daniel's smirk and the way the whole party had laughed along, as if her worth could be measured by a ring on her hand. By the time the sun rose fully over the highway, something inside her shifted. The tears dried on her cheeks, and in their place came a hard, quiet resolve. She would not go back. Not until she had built something so undeniable that no one could laugh at her again. Not until she stood so tall that mockery could not reach her. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. Hours later, she stopped at a gas station in a town she had never heard of, 3 states away from everything familiar. She filled her tank with the last of her cash and bought a cup of coffee from a machine that rattled and groaned before pouring it. She sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at a map on her phone, watching the blue dot that marked her location blink in a place with no name attached to any memory. A woman tapped on her window. She had kind eyes and gray hair pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore an apron with the name of the gas station stitched across the front. "You look lost, sweetheart," the woman said when Clara rolled down the window. "I am," Clara admitted. It was the first honest thing she had said in weeks. The woman studied her for a moment, taking in the suitcases in the back seat, the tired eyes, the trembling hands still wrapped around a paper coffee cup. "There's a diner 2 blocks that way," the woman said, pointing down the road. "They're always looking for help. Might not be much, but it's a start if you need one." Clara thanked her, though she had no real plan to follow the suggestion. But an hour later, with nowhere else to go and no family waiting for her anywhere, she found herself walking into that diner, asking if the position was still open. The manager, a stocky man named Peter Doyle, looked her over and asked if she had any experience. "I learn fast," Clara said, which was true, though she had never worked in food service before in her life. He hired her on the spot, mostly because no one else had shown interest in the job for the past 2 weeks, and he needed help before the weekend rush. Clara started that same evening, tying an apron around her waist with hands that had never carried a serving tray before. She dropped a plate within the first hour. She spilled coffee on a man's newspaper within the second. But she did not quit. and by the end of the night, she had learned the names of half the regular customers and the order in which they liked their coffee refilled. She rented a small room above a laundromat for the next few weeks, paying in cash, sleeping on a mattress that sank in the middle. At night, she would lie awake and think of her old life, the family gatherings, the mockery, the way her mother's silence had cut deeper than Daniel's words ever could. She let herself feel the loss, just for a while, before she pushed it down and reminded herself why she had left. She began saving every dollar she could. She picked up extra shifts. She skipped meals more often than she should have. She read books on business and finance that she borrowed from the small public library down the street, sitting under a flickering lamp late into the night while her body ached from a full day on her feet. One evening, a woman came into the diner wearing a sharp gray suit, carrying a leather folder and looking entirely out of place among the truckers and tired families who usually filled the booths. She ordered black coffee and asked Clara, almost as an afterthought, what she did before working at the diner. "Nothing that mattered," Clara answered honestly. The woman studied her for a long moment. "You carry yourself well for someone who thinks that," she said. "I run a small real estate office 2 towns over. We're short-staffed, and I need someone who can learn quickly and talk to people without making them feel like they're being sold something. You interested?" Clara almost laughed at the sudden turn of fortune, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes," she said, "I'm interested." That conversation changed the direction of her life. Within a month, Clara had left the diner behind, though she never forgot the kindness of the woman who first pointed her toward it. She threw herself into learning the real estate business with the same determination that had carried her out of that family lawn months earlier. She studied contracts at night. She practiced her phone voice until it sounded confident instead of nervous. She showed houses to strangers and slowly began to understand what people wanted when they searched for a place to call home. Within a year, she had earned her own license. Within 2 years, she had built a small client base that trusted her more than they trusted agents who had been in the business for decades. She worked harder than anyone else in her office, arriving before sunrise and staying long after the lights in other buildings had gone dark. She still thought of her family sometimes, especially during holidays, when the ache of being alone crept back in despite everything she had built. But she never called. She never wrote. She let the silence between them grow into its own kind of wall, one she was not yet ready to tear down. She did not know, on that first morning she drove away from the lawn where Daniel had mocked her, that the road ahead would eventually lead her back to that same town, changed beyond recognition, and standing beside a man whose quiet strength would make every word Daniel had ever spoken feel small and forgotten. For now, she only knew one thing. She would not return until she had nothing left to prove. There were nights when doubt crept in harder than usual, when Clara sat alone in her small rented room and wondered if she had made a mistake by leaving everything behind so suddenly. She would take out her phone, scroll to her mother's number, and hover her thumb over the call button for long minutes before setting the phone down without dialing. She was not ready to hear her mother's voice yet, not ready to explain herself to people who had never once asked how she truly felt. Instead, she poured that uncertainty into her work. She learned to read people the moment they walked through a front door, to sense whether they wanted a quiet street or a lively neighborhood, whether they were searching for a home to raise children in, or a place to finally live for themselves. She built a reputation for listening more than she spoke, and clients began asking for her by name, telling their friends about the young agent who seemed to understand exactly what they needed before they said it aloud. She rented her own small apartment eventually, modest but clean, with a window that looked out over a quiet street lined with maple trees. She hung no photographs of her family on the walls. Instead, she framed a single picture of the open road she had driven that first morning, a reminder of the moment she chose herself over everyone who had doubted her. On the first anniversary of that humiliating evening, Clara stood in front of her bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. Her eyes looked different now, steadier, less afraid. She whispered a promise to herself, the same promise she repeated every year that followed. "One day," she said quietly, "I will walk back into that town, and no one will ever laugh at me again." And so, mile by mile, client by client, Clara Bennett began building the life that would one day carry her back to that town on her own terms, transformed into a woman no one there would recognize, and certainly no one would dare to mock again. The phone rang 3 times before Clara answered it, tucking it between her shoulder and ear while she sorted through a stack of listing papers on her desk. "Miss Bennett," the voice on the other end said, smooth and unhurried, carrying the warmth of the American South in every syllable. "My name is Bo Calloway. I was told you handle properties on the east side of the city, and I have a rather unusual request." Clara set down her papers, curious despite the busy morning ahead of her. I'm listening, Mr. Calloway. I'm looking to purchase several properties at once. Not for myself, but for a project my family has been planning for years. It involves restoring old buildings rather than tearing them down. I was told you're the agent who understands buildings the way most people understand faces, that you can tell their story just by looking at them. Clara smiled at the description, though she kept her voice professional. That's a generous way of putting it, but yes, I suppose I do see buildings that way. When would you like to meet? They agreed to meet the following afternoon at a row of neglected brick buildings near the edge of downtown. Structures that had been empty for years, their windows boarded and their brick faces stained by decades of rain and neglect. Clara arrived early, standing on the cracked sidewalk with her folder of documents pressed to her chest, studying the buildings the way she always did before a client arrived, searching for what made them worth saving. A dark car pulled up a few minutes later, and a tall man stepped out, dressed in a fine gray suit that fit him as though it had been made for no one else. He had dark hair combed neatly back, a strong jaw softened by an easy smile, and eyes that held a calm confidence Clara had rarely seen in the men she usually dealt with in business. He walked toward her with an unhurried grace, extending his hand. "Beau Calloway," he said. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice." "Clara Bennett," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "These buildings have quite a story, if you're ready to hear it." He smiled, genuinely intrigued. "I came all this way to hear exactly that." For the next hour, Clara walked him through each building, pointing out the original woodwork hidden beneath layers of grime, the high ceilings that spoke of a grander era, the brick facades that could be restored rather than replaced. Beau listened closely, asking thoughtful questions, occasionally running his hand along a wall as though he could feel the history embedded in it. Clara found herself impressed by how carefully he considered every detail, not just the potential profit, but the character of what he was about to purchase. By the end of the tour, he had made his decision. "I'll take all 4 buildings," he said, "and I'd like you to oversee the transaction personally, if you're willing." Clara agreed, and over the following weeks, their professional relationship deepened into something steady and comfortable. They met often to discuss permits, renovation plans, and timelines. Beau proved to be nothing like the wealthy clients Clara had dealt with before, men who spoke over her or dismissed her opinions the moment a decision grew complicated. He listened. He asked for her thoughts on design choices, on which features of each building deserved to be preserved. He treated her as an equal, and slowly, without either of them acknowledging it aloud, a quiet respect grew between them. One afternoon, after a long meeting with contractors, Beau invited Clara to a nearby cafe to review the final blueprints over coffee. They sat at a small table near the window, papers spread between them, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. "You have a talent most people spend a lifetime searching for," Beau said, setting down his cup. "You see potential where others see ruin." Clara looked up from the blueprints, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "I suppose I learned that from experience," she said carefully. "I know what it's like to be written off before anyone gives you the chance to prove otherwise." Beau tilted his head slightly, studying her with quiet curiosity, but he did not push for more. He simply nodded, as though he understood there was a story behind her words that she was not yet ready to share. Their working relationship continued for several months, the 4 buildings slowly transforming from crumbling shells into vibrant spaces filled with small businesses and new apartments. Clara took pride in watching the neighborhood come back to life, block by block, and she found herself looking forward to her meetings with Beau more than she cared to admit. One evening, after the final building had been officially completed, Beau invited her to see the finished project at sunset, when the newly restored windows caught the last light of the day and turned the brick facades a warm shade of gold. They stood together on the sidewalk, admiring the transformation in comfortable silence. "You did this," Clara said softly, looking up at the building that had once been the most damaged of the 4. "You could have torn it all down and built something new. It would have been easier." "Easier isn't always better," Beau replied, his eyes fixed on the building rather than on her. "Some things deserve a second chance, even when they've been neglected for a long time, buildings included." Something in the way he said it made Clara wonder if he was speaking about more than architecture, but she pushed the thought aside, unwilling to let herself hope for something she had convinced herself she no longer needed. As the weeks passed, their meetings continued, even after the official business had concluded. Beau found reasons to call, to ask her opinion on a new property he was considering, to invite her to dinner under the guise of discussing future projects. Clara found herself accepting each invitation, telling herself it was simply good business practice to maintain a valuable client relationship, though a quieter part of her knew the truth ran deeper than that. During one of these dinners, seated in a quiet restaurant with candlelight flickering between them, Bo finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind for weeks. "Tell me about your family, Clara," he said gently. "You've mentioned everyone else in your life, your clients, your colleagues, even the woman who gave you your first job at that gas station diner, but never your family." Clara set down her fork, feeling the familiar tightness rise in her chest. She had avoided this conversation with everyone she had met since leaving her hometown, but something about Bo's steady patience made her feel safe enough to finally speak the truth aloud. "I left them," she admitted quietly. "Years ago, after my cousin mocked me in front of the entire family at a gathering. He said cruel things about me being unmarried, about my life being empty, and everyone laughed along with him. My own mother said nothing to defend me, so I packed my things that same night and drove away without telling anyone where I was going." Bo's expression remained calm, but something in his eyes shifted, a quiet protectiveness that Clara had not expected. "That must have taken tremendous courage," he said, "to walk away from everything familiar, rather than stay somewhere you were treated so poorly." "It didn't feel like courage at the time," Clara said. "It felt like running." "Sometimes running is the bravest thing a person can do," Bo replied, "especially when what you're running from would have kept you small forever." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, surprised by how deeply his words landed. No one had ever framed her decision that way before. To her family, she imagined, she was simply the daughter who disappeared without explanation, the sister who cut ties for no good reason. But to Bo, in that quiet restaurant with candlelight flickering between them, she was something else entirely. She was brave. "Do you ever think about going back?" Bo asked carefully. "Sometimes," Clara admitted, "but not until I've built something undeniable. Not until I have nothing left to prove." Bo reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own, a simple gesture that carried more warmth than words could express. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you've already proven more than enough. But when you're ready, I hope you'll let me stand beside you." Clara looked up at him, startled by the quiet promise in his voice, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included someone else standing beside her when she finally returned home. Word of the restoration project spread quickly through the city, and soon Clara's name became attached to more than a single client. Developers who had once overlooked her began requesting her by name, impressed by how she had transformed 4 crumbling buildings into a thriving corner of the city. Her small office grew busier, her calendar filled weeks in advance, and for the first time since she had arrived with nothing but 2 suitcases, she felt the quiet satisfaction of being respected for her work rather than judged for her circumstances. Not everything moved smoothly, however. A rival agent named Grant Pierce, who had lost the restoration contract to Clara months earlier, grew bitter watching her success unfold. He spread quiet rumors among mutual clients, suggesting she had underbid the project unfairly, or that her methods were more luck than skill. Clara heard the whispers secondhand, from a colleague who thought she deserved to know, and the old wound of being doubted and dismissed threatened to reopen. She considered ignoring it, the way she had once ignored so many slights from her family, letting silence protect her from further embarrassment. But something had changed in her since that night on the lawn. She no longer wanted to disappear quietly from conflict. She wanted to stand and answer it directly. She requested a meeting with the small business association that had heard the rumors, bringing with her the complete records of the restoration project, the before and after photographs, the honest bids and contracts that proved every step had been handled with integrity. She spoke calmly and clearly, without anger, laying out the truth in a way that left no room for doubt. By the end of the meeting, several members who had hesitated to work with her before were requesting appointments of their own. When she told Bo about the confrontation later that week, he listened with quiet pride rather than surprise. "You didn't need me to defend you," he said. "You handled it exactly the way someone who trusts her own worth would handle it." "I used to run from conflict," Clara admitted. "I used to let people say whatever they wanted about me and just absorb it quietly." "And now?" Bo asked. "Now I'd rather answer with the truth than hide from a lie," she said. Bo smiled, a warmth in his expression that reached far deeper than simple admiration. "That," he said softly, "is the woman I've come to know these past few months. I hope you never lose her." Their bond continued to grow through small moments rather than dramatic ones, a shared laugh over a contractor's terrible attempt at humor, a quiet drive along the river after a long day of work, a phone call late at night simply to say goodnight. Clara found herself trusting him in ways she had not trusted anyone since leaving her hometown, and though fear still lingered at the edges of her heart, whispering that good things rarely lasted, she allowed herself, slowly and carefully, to believe that this time might be different. Bo Calloway had grown up in a large white house surrounded by oak trees on the outskirts of Savannah, a house that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. His father, a stern man named Walter Calloway, had built much of the family's wealth through land and shipping investments, and he had raised Bo with the expectation that he would one day inherit not just the business, but the responsibility of upholding a family name respected throughout the region. From a young age, Bo understood the weight of expectations. He learned to negotiate before he learned to drive, sitting in on business meetings where grown men twice his age discussed contracts and land deals over glasses of sweet tea. His father believed that softness had no place in business, and though Bo respected the discipline instilled in him, he often felt something missing in the cold efficiency his father valued above all else. His mother, Eleanor Calloway, had been the gentler influence in his life, a woman who loved gardening and old books and who often reminded her son that kindness was not weakness, no matter what his father believed. She passed away when Bo was in his early 20s, and her death left a quiet ache in him that never fully faded, a reminder that time was not something to be wasted on empty pursuits. In his late 20s, Bo had been engaged to a woman named Charlotte Winslow, the daughter of a prominent family his father approved of wholeheartedly. Their relationship had been built more on convenience and family expectation than genuine affection, and Bo had known, even as he proposed, that something essential was missing between them. Charlotte broke the engagement herself 2 months before the wedding, choosing instead to marry a man with a larger fortune and a more prominent family name. The humiliation of that broken engagement had followed Bo through Savannah's social circles for years, whispered about at galas and dinner parties, though few dared to mention it directly to his face given his family's influence. He had thrown himself into work afterward, expanding the family business beyond shipping into real estate and restoration projects, determined to prove that his worth extended far beyond a failed engagement. It was this history that made Bo immediately recognize something familiar in Clara's story when she finally shared it with him. He understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to be humiliated in front of people who were supposed to love you, and to rebuild yourself into someone stronger despite the wound left behind. His father, upon learning of Bo's growing relationship with Clara, was far from pleased. "A real estate agent from nowhere," Walter Calloway said dismissively during a rare visit to the family estate. "You could have anyone, Bo. Anyone with a proper family name and proper connections. Why choose someone with no background, no history worth mentioning?" Bo's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Her background is exactly why I respect her, father. She built everything she has with her own hands, without a family name to open doors for her. That matters more to me than any connection you could arrange." "Sentiment," Walter scoffed. "You sound like your mother. I consider that the highest compliment you could give me," Bo replied evenly, ending the conversation before it could grow more heated. Despite his father's disapproval, Bo continued pursuing his relationship with Clara, visiting her more frequently, finding reasons to extend his business trips to her city, learning the small details of her daily life that most people never bothered to notice. He remembered how she took her coffee, the way she always checked twice that her office door was locked before leaving, the small line that formed between her eyebrows whenever she concentrated on a difficult contract. One evening, several months into their relationship, Bo invited Clara to visit Savannah for the first time, wanting to show her the world he had come from, the estate where he had grown up, the gardens his mother had once tended with such devotion. Clara accepted, though nervousness tightened in her chest at the thought of meeting his family, particularly a father known throughout the region for his sharp tongue and exacting standards. The estate took her breath away the moment she arrived, sprawling green lawns bordered by ancient oak trees draped in soft gray moss, a white house with tall columns that seemed to belong to another century entirely. Bo led her through the gardens first, pointing out the roses his mother had planted decades earlier, still blooming faithfully every spring despite years of neglect after her passing. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly, running her fingers along a cluster of pale pink blossoms. "Your mother must have loved this place deeply." "She did," Bo said, a note of quiet sadness in his voice. "She used to say a garden reflects patience more than any other part of life. You cannot force a flower to bloom before it's ready, no matter how much you want it to." Clara turned to look at him, struck by how closely his mother's philosophy mirrored her own experience of rebuilding her life piece by piece, without rushing, without forcing healing before it was ready to come. The dinner with Walter Calloway that evening proved as difficult as Clara had feared. He asked pointed questions about her family, her education, her financial standing, each question delivered with a coolness meant to make her feel small. Clara answered every question honestly and directly, refusing to shrink beneath his scrutiny the way she once might have. "I don't come from wealth, Mr. Calloway," she said plainly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I built my career from nothing, one client at a time, one difficult year at a time. If that disqualifies me in your eyes, I understand, but I won't apologize for the path that brought me here." Walter studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his sharp eyes, though he said nothing further on the matter that evening. Later, as Beau walked Clara to the guest room where she would spend the night, he squeezed her hand gently. "You handled him better than most people twice your age," he said, admiration clear in his voice. "I've had practice standing my ground," Clara replied with a tired smile. "Your father reminds me a little of my own family, in a way. People who measure worth by things that don't actually matter." Beau paused at the door of the guest room, turning to face her fully. "You matter to me, Clara, not because of anything you've built or anything you could give my family, just because of who you are." The words settled deep in Clara's chest, warm and steady, and for the first time since leaving her hometown years earlier, she allowed herself to imagine a life built not on proving her worth to others, but on being simply and completely accepted for who she had become. Over the following weeks, Walter Calloway's resistance softened, though slowly. He began asking Beau about Clara's work with genuine curiosity rather than dismissive skepticism. He mentioned, almost reluctantly, that her handling of their difficult dinner conversation had reminded him of his late wife's quiet strength. By the time Beau proposed to Clara 6 months later, standing beneath the same oak trees where his mother's roses still bloomed each spring, even Walter offered his blessing, gruff but genuine. Clara said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down her face as Beau slid a simple, elegant ring onto her finger, the same finger Daniel had once mocked for being empty. She thought, in that quiet moment beneath the oak trees, of how far she had come from that humiliating evening on her family's lawn, and how the emptiness Daniel had mocked her for had never truly been empty at all. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to be filled. The morning after the proposal, Clara woke early and wandered alone through the estate gardens while Beau still slept. The dew clung to the grass beneath her bare feet, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and old wood smoke drifting from a neighboring chimney. She sat on a stone bench beneath the largest oak tree, turning the new ring on her finger slowly, watching the morning light catch its edges. A groundskeeper named Otis, an older man who had tended the estate for nearly 40 years, approached with a small watering can in hand. He nodded politely to Clara before kneeling beside a bed of white lilies near the bench. "Miss Eleanor planted these the year young Beau was born," Otis said, not looking up from his work. "Said a garden should grow alongside a family, not separate from it. Took real good care of this place, she did, right up until she couldn't anymore." Clara watched him work in comfortable silence for a moment. "Did you know her well?" "Well enough to know she'd have liked you," Otis said, glancing up with a small, knowing smile. "She always said the right person for Beau would be someone who understood patience, someone who didn't need a big house or a big name to know their own worth." He paused, studying Clara for a moment longer. "You strike me as exactly that kind of person, if you don't mind an old man saying so." The words settled warmly in Clara's chest, another quiet confirmation that she had found not just a partner in Beau, but perhaps a family willing to accept her without condition, something she had not experienced since childhood, if she had ever truly experienced it at all. Later that same week, Beau took Clara to visit the offices where the Calloway family business operated, introducing her to employees who had worked for his father for decades. Many of them greeted her warmly, curious about the woman who had finally won Beau's heart after years of quiet solitude following his broken engagement to Charlotte Winslow. One older employee, a bookkeeper named Ruth Dalton who had worked for the family since Beau was a child, pulled Clara aside during a quiet moment in the hallway. "I watched that boy grow up," Ruth said, glancing toward Beau's office where he stood in conversation with a business partner. "Watched him get his heart broken by a woman who never deserved him in the first place. Never seen him smile the way he smiles now, not in all these years. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Clara thanked her, touched by the sincerity in the older woman's voice, and found herself reflecting once again on how thoroughly her life had transformed since that painful evening on her family's lawn. She had arrived in a new city with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart, and now she stood in the hallway of a respected family business, welcomed by people who had known Beau his entire life, treated not as an outsider but as someone who truly belonged. That evening, Beau took her to dinner at a small restaurant along the river, away from the formality of his father's estate, somewhere they could simply enjoy each other's company, without the weight of family expectations pressing down on them. Over a quiet meal, Bo spoke more openly than he ever had before about the years following his broken engagement, the loneliness he had carried, the way he had thrown himself into work to avoid confronting the emptiness Charlotte's betrayal had left behind. "I spent years convincing myself I didn't need anyone," Bo admitted, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. "That work and family duty were enough to fill whatever Charlotte left behind. But meeting you showed me how much I'd been lying to myself." "I understand that better than you might think," Clara said softly. "I spent years telling myself the same thing. That being alone was simply my life now, and I'd made peace with it. But peace and acceptance aren't always the same thing." Bo reached across the table and took her hand gently. "I'm grateful every day that neither of us settled for that kind of peace." Their conversation drifted naturally toward Clara's own family, toward the mother who had never once defended her, the cousin whose mockery had driven her away, the childhood friend named Louise who had remained a steady presence in her thoughts despite years of silence between them. Bo listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions, never pushing her further than she was ready to go. "When you're ready to return," Bo said as their dinner drew to a close, "I meant what I told you months ago. I'll stand beside you, whatever that means for your family. Whatever reception waits for you there." Clara studied his face in the candlelight, searching for any trace of hesitation or doubt, and found none. Only steady, quiet certainty, the same certainty that had carried her through every difficult moment since she first met him. "I think I'm almost ready," she said quietly. "I just need a little more time." "Take whatever time you need," Bo said. "I'm not going anywhere." As their wedding plans began to take shape in the months that followed, Clara found herself thinking more and more of her mother, of Louise, her childhood friend who had stayed behind, of the town she had left without a word all those years ago. A new resolve began forming within her, quiet but unshakable. She would return, not out of anger or a need for revenge, but because she was finally ready, because she finally had nothing left to prove, and everything she needed already stood beside her. Wedding plans consumed the following months, but Clara insisted on a small ceremony. Nothing like the extravagant affairs typical of the Calloway family's social circle. Bo agreed without hesitation, understanding that Clara valued sincerity over spectacle, intimacy over impression. They chose a modest chapel near the estate, decorated simply with white flowers and soft candlelight, a place that felt warm rather than grand. During the planning, Bo made a habit of courting Clara in ways that felt almost old-fashioned, compared to the relationships she had witnessed among her colleagues back home. He wrote her handwritten letters even though they lived only a short drive apart, leaving them tucked beneath her office door or slipped into her coat pocket before she left for work in the morning. Each letter carried small observations about their days together, quiet appreciations for things most people overlooked, the way she hummed softly while reviewing paperwork, the patient way she explained complicated contracts to first-time homebuyers who felt overwhelmed by the process. One letter, which Clara kept folded in her desk drawer long after reading it a dozen times, simply read, "I have watched you build an entire life from nothing but determination and quiet courage. I do not deserve to witness such strength up close, and yet here I am, grateful every single day that I do." These small gestures accumulated over time, forming a foundation of trust and tenderness that felt entirely different from the calculated courtships Clara had witnessed among wealthier acquaintances she met through Bo's social circle. He never rushed her, never pressured her toward decisions she wasn't ready to make, never once made her feel as though her past or her family's rejection diminished her value in his eyes. Their quiet routine continued for weeks, evenings spent reviewing wedding details over dinner, weekends spent walking through gardens or visiting small towns along the coast that reminded Clara of home, without carrying its painful memories. She began healing in ways she had not expected, allowing herself to trust fully for the first time since that humiliating evening on her family's lawn. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Clara's phone rang while she sat in her office reviewing a stack of contracts. The number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar, a local area code from her hometown, one she had not seen in years. Her hand trembled slightly as she answered, some instinct warning her that whatever waited on the other end would change everything. "Clara?" The voice was older, weaker than she remembered, but unmistakably her mother's. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Mom? I know I have no right to call you," Margaret Bennett said, her voice thin and shaking. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after everything. But your grandmother is very ill, Clara. The doctors don't think she has much time left. She's been asking for you, even in her confusion. I thought you should know, whatever you decide to do with that information." Clara closed her eyes, memories flooding back all at once. Her grandmother's warm kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread. The woman who had always defended her when others in the family grew critical. The one relative who had never once questioned why Clara remained unmarried, who had simply loved her without condition. "Where is she?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hospital, just outside of town," Margaret said. "I know it's a lot to ask, coming back after everything. I understand if you can't." Clara sat in silence for a long moment, torn between years of carefully protected distance and the aching need to see her grandmother one final time. "I'll come," she said finally. "I need a day or two to arrange things, but I'll come." After ending the call, Clara sat frozen at her desk, staring at nothing in particular, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. When Beau arrived that evening to pick her up for dinner, he found her still sitting there, tears streaking silently down her face. "What happened?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her chair. Clara explained everything: the phone call, her grandmother's illness, her mother's trembling voice carrying years of unspoken guilt. Beau listened patiently, holding her hand throughout, offering no easy solutions, only steady presence. "I have to go back," Clara said finally. "I don't know what I'll find there, how they'll react to seeing me again after all this time, especially with everything that happened with Daniel. But I can't let my grandmother pass without seeing her one more time." "Then we'll go together," Beau said without hesitation. "You don't have to come," Clara said, though gratitude flooded through her at the offer. "This isn't your burden to carry." "It became my burden the moment I asked you to marry me," Beau replied firmly. "Whatever waits for you in that town, you won't face it alone. Not while I'm standing beside you." Clara studied his face, searching for any hint of hesitation, and found none, only unwavering resolve. She thought of Daniel's mocking words years earlier, of her mother's silence, of the family gathering where laughter had cut deeper than any single insult. She thought of everything she had built since then, the career, the confidence, the love she had found in a man who saw her worth clearly from the very beginning. "All right," she said quietly, "we'll go together." They arranged their travel for the following morning, Clara packing a small bag with hands that shook slightly despite her outward calm. Beau remained steady throughout, handling logistics, arranging flights, ensuring every detail was managed so Clara could focus solely on preparing herself emotionally for what waited ahead. The night before their departure, Clara stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the quiet street below, memories of that first desperate drive away from her hometown replaying in her mind. She thought of the woman she had been then, frightened and humiliated, fleeing without a plan or a destination. She thought of the woman she had become since, steady, accomplished, loved deeply by a man who respected every part of her story. Beau found her there, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin against the top of her head. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he murmured, "you are not the same woman who left that town years ago. Remember that, no matter what waits for you there." Clara leaned back against him, drawing strength from his steady presence, and for the first time since receiving her mother's phone call, she allowed herself to believe that she was truly ready to face whatever awaited her return. The following morning, they boarded a small plane bound for the town Clara had left behind years earlier, the town where Daniel's mockery had once cut so deeply, where her mother's silence had wounded her more than any single insult ever could. Before they left the estate that morning, Walter Calloway had surprised them both by appearing at the front steps just as their car was being loaded. He rarely rose before mid-morning, and his presence at such an early hour caught Clara off guard. "I heard about your grandmother," Walter said gruffly, his usual sharp tone softened by something Clara had not heard from him before. "Families can be cruel creatures, even when they claim to love each other most. I know that better than most men." He paused, glancing toward Beau before continuing. "You go and see her, and you hold your head high while you do it. Whatever waits for you there, you walk in as a Calloway now, and that name carries weight, should you need to lean on it." Clara had not expected such words from a man who had questioned her worth so thoroughly during their first dinner together months earlier. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said sincerely. "That means more than you know." "Take care of her," Walter said to his son, a rare softness in his voice, before turning and walking back toward the house without waiting for a response. Ruth Dalton had pressed a small embroidered handkerchief into Clara's hand as she left the office the previous evening, the same handkerchief Eleanor Calloway had once carried during difficult family gatherings decades earlier. "For strength," Ruth had said simply. Miss Eleanor always said a woman needs something to hold on to when facing a room full of people who doubted her. Clara carried that handkerchief tucked carefully in her purse as they boarded the plane. A small but powerful reminder that she was not walking into this homecoming without support, without people who believed in her worth regardless of what waited in her hometown. During the flight, Beau reviewed the details Margaret had shared during a follow-up phone call the previous evening. Clara's grandmother, a woman named Dorothy Bennett, had been moved to a hospital just outside town after a sudden decline in her health. The family had gathered at her bedside in shifts, and word had apparently spread quickly through the small community that Clara Bennett, missing for years, might finally be returning. "Your mother mentioned something else," Beau said carefully, watching Clara's reaction. "Daniel has been struggling. His construction business failed 2 years ago, and from what your mother said, he's been living with his parents since, unable to find steady work." She wasn't specific about why she brought it up, but I thought you should know before we arrive. Clara absorbed this information quietly, feeling no satisfaction in Daniel's misfortune, only a strange, distant sadness for the man who had once mocked her so cruelly. She had spent years imagining various versions of a return to her hometown, some fueled by anger, others by quiet triumph, but none of those imagined scenarios had prepared her for the complicated mixture of emotions she felt now, facing the reality of seeing him again under such different circumstances. "I don't want this to be about him," Clara said finally. "I'm going back for my grandmother. Whatever happens with Daniel, with my mother, with everyone else, that's secondary to seeing her one more time." "I understand," Beau said, squeezing her hand gently. "But you should be prepared, regardless of your intentions. People don't always let go of old dynamics easily, especially when they see how much has changed." Clara nodded, staring out the small window at the clouds drifting past below them, gathering her resolve for whatever waited on the other side of this journey. She thought of her grandmother's warm kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, the woman's steady voice always reminding her that her worth had never depended on a ring or a wedding date. She thought of Louise, her childhood friend, wondering if their friendship had survived the years of silence between them, and she thought of Daniel, of the mockery that had once driven her away, wondering what kind of reception awaited her now that the tables had turned so completely. As the plane began its descent toward the small regional airport near her hometown, Clara reached for Beau's hand, drawing courage from his steady grip, preparing herself for a homecoming she had never imagined would come so soon, or under such difficult circumstances. The hospital smelled exactly the way Clara remembered hospitals smelling, a mixture of antiseptic and something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stale water. She walked through the sliding doors with Beau close beside her, her heart pounding harder with every step down the familiar hallway toward the room number her mother had given over the phone. Margaret Bennett stood outside the room, thinner than Clara remembered, her hair now streaked heavily with gray, deep lines etched around her tired eyes. When she saw Clara approaching, she froze, one hand rising to her mouth as though she could not quite believe what she was seeing. "Clara," she whispered, tears immediately welling in her eyes. "You came." "I came for Grandma," Clara said, her voice steady, though her chest felt tight with a tangle of emotions she had not fully prepared herself for. "How is she?" "Weak," Margaret said. "But she's been asking for you every day since we told her you might come. She'll be so happy to see you." Her eyes shifted to Beau, taking in his tailored suit and confident bearing, clearly unsure how to address the unfamiliar man standing protectively beside her daughter. "This is Beau Calloway," Clara said simply. "My fiancé." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, surprise and something like shame flickering across her expression. "It's nice to meet you," she managed, extending a trembling hand. Beau shook it warmly, his voice gentle despite the tension thick in the air. "Clara has told me a great deal about her grandmother. I'm honored to be here, even under difficult circumstances." They entered the hospital room together, and Clara's breath caught at the sight of her grandmother, so much smaller and frailer than the vibrant woman she remembered from childhood. Dorothy Bennett's eyes fluttered open at the sound of footsteps, and when she saw Clara, her face broke into a smile so genuine and warm that tears immediately spilled down Clara's cheeks. "There's my girl," Dorothy whispered, her voice weak but full of affection. "I knew you'd come." Clara rushed to her bedside, taking her grandmother's frail hand gently in her own. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm so sorry it took me this long." "Don't you apologize," Dorothy said, squeezing her hand with surprising strength. "You did what you needed to do. Look at you now, glowing like I've never seen you glow before." Her eyes shifted toward Beau, studying him with the same sharp perceptiveness Clara remembered from childhood. "And who is this handsome young man?" "This is Beau," Clara said, smiling through her tears. "We're engaged." Dorothy's smile widened further, genuine joy lighting up her tired features. "Well, It's about time someone with good sense recognized what a treasure you are. Come here, young man. Let an old woman get a proper look at you. Bo approached the bedside with genuine warmth, taking Dorothy's other hand gently. It's an honor to finally meet you, ma'am. Clara speaks of you often, always with tremendous love. They spent the next hour at Dorothy's bedside, the older woman asking careful questions about their life together, about Bo's family, about the career Clara had built from nothing. Despite her physical weakness, Dorothy's mind remained sharp, and her obvious approval of Bo brought a warmth to the room that eased some of the tension Clara had carried since arriving. Word of Clara's return spread quickly through the small hospital and beyond, as such news always did in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. By the following afternoon, when Clara and Bo returned to visit Dorothy again, several relatives had gathered in the hospital waiting room, drawn by curiosity and gossip about the daughter who had vanished years earlier, now returned with a wealthy, well-dressed fiancé at her side. Clara felt the weight of their stares the moment she entered the waiting room, whispered conversations falling silent as she passed, eyes tracking her every movement. She kept her chin lifted, her hand steady in Bo's grip, refusing to let old insecurities resurface despite the familiar prickle of judgment crawling across her skin. Daniel Whitfield sat near the far corner of the waiting room, noticeably thinner than Clara remembered, his once confident posture now slightly hunched, his clothes worn rather than sharp. When his eyes landed on Clara, recognition flickered across his face, followed quickly by something like disbelief, as he took in Bo's expensive suit and the easy, protective way he stood beside her. "Well, well," Daniel said, standing slowly, some remnant of his old arrogance surfacing despite his obviously diminished circumstances. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence. Still playing dress-up with rich company, Clara?" The room fell silent, several relatives shifting uncomfortably at his tone, clearly uncertain whether to intervene or let the confrontation play out. Clara felt the old familiar sting rise in her chest, the same humiliation she had carried away from that lawn years earlier, but this time, something steadier rose alongside it, a quiet confidence built through years of proving herself without needing anyone's approval. "Daniel," Clara said calmly, her voice carrying clearly across the waiting room. "It's been a long time. Not long enough, apparently, for you to remember where you came from." Daniel shot back, though his voice lacked the confident bite it once carried. "Still need a man to validate you, I see. Nothing's really changed." Before Clara could respond, Bo stepped forward slightly, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable firmness that silenced the room further. "I think you have that backward," Bo said evenly. "Clara built an entire career and a life for herself long before I ever entered the picture. I'm fortunate enough to stand beside her, not the other way around. If you'd taken the time to know the person you were mocking all those years ago, you might understand that." Daniel's face flushed, clearly unprepared for such a direct and composed response. He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out, his usual arrogance faltering under the weight of Bo's steady gaze and Clara's unshaken composure. Louise Hartley, who had been sitting quietly near the window throughout the exchange, rose to her feet and crossed the room, wrapping Clara in a tight, unexpected embrace. "I've missed you so much," Louise whispered, tears in her eyes. "I never stopped hoping you'd come back." The warmth of Louise's welcome broke through some of the tension in the room, and Clara found herself laughing softly through tears as her old friend pulled back to study her face. "Look at you," Louise said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You look incredible, Clara. Truly." "It's good to see you, Louise," Clara said sincerely. "I'm sorry I disappeared without a word. That wasn't fair to you." "You did what you had to do," Louise said firmly. "I understood, even if it hurt not knowing where you'd gone. I'm just glad you're finally back, even under these circumstances." Margaret watched the exchange from a few steps away, her expression a complicated mixture of shame and hesitant hope. When Clara finally turned to face her mother directly, the waiting room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this long-overdue confrontation would unfold. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said quietly, her voice shaking. "I should have defended you that night. I should have said something when Daniel mocked you in front of everyone. Instead, I stayed silent, and I've regretted it every single day since you left." Clara studied her mother's face, searching for the same dismissiveness she remembered from years earlier, but finding instead genuine remorse, years of guilt etched into every line of her tired features. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" Clara asked, her voice quieter now, less guarded. "I was afraid," Margaret admitted. "Afraid of conflict, afraid of upsetting the family, afraid of so many things that don't matter nearly as much as they seemed to back then. I let my fear cost me my relationship with my own daughter. and I've carried that regret every single day you've been gone." Tears filled Clara's eyes as years of carefully guarded hurt finally began loosening their grip on her heart. She had imagined this moment countless times since leaving. Imagined anger, imagined coldness, imagined walking away without offering forgiveness. But standing in that hospital waiting room, watching her mother's genuine remorse, surrounded by Beau's steady support and Louise's warm welcome, Clara felt something unexpected settle over her. Not forgetting, but forgiveness, slow and imperfect, beginning to take root. "I'm not the same person who left, Mom," Clara said softly. "But I'm willing to try, if you are too." Margaret nodded, tears streaming freely now, reaching out tentatively to embrace her daughter for the first time in years. Clara accepted the embrace, feeling years of tension slowly begin to unwind, though she knew healing this deep would take more than a single conversation in a hospital waiting room. Daniel, watching the reconciliation unfold from the corner of the room, seemed to shrink further into himself, the weight of his own bitterness and failure evident in his slumped posture. As Clara turned to walk back toward her grandmother's room with Beau and Louise beside her, she glanced back once at her cousin, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, distant pity for a man who had built his own life on the mockery of others, rather than the harder work of building something meaningful himself. Over the following days, Clara spent hours at her grandmother's bedside, rebuilding fragile bridges with her mother, reconnecting with Louise over quiet coffee dates that felt as natural as though no time had passed at all. Beau remained a steady, protective presence throughout, earning quiet respect from relatives who had initially eyed him with suspicion, winning them over with his genuine warmth and obvious devotion to Clara. Dorothy Bennett's condition stabilized slightly over the following week, enough that doctors cautiously suggested she might have more time than initially feared. Clara took this as a gift, extending her stay to spend as much time as possible with her grandmother, weaving herself carefully back into the fabric of a family she had once fled without explanation. On the fourth day of their stay, Louise invited Clara and Beau to dinner at her small house on the edge of town, wanting a quieter setting to properly catch up away from the hospital's tense atmosphere. Louise's husband, a kind, easygoing man named Peter Hartley, welcomed them warmly, and their two young children immediately took a liking to Beau, tugging him toward the backyard to admire a treehouse he had apparently built with his own hands. Over a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables, Louise filled Clara in on everything she had missed during her years away, the small changes in town, the marriages and births and quiet tragedies that had unfolded while Clara built her new life elsewhere. She spoke carefully about Daniel, choosing her words with visible caution. "His construction business failed after some bad investments," Louise explained. "He lost almost everything. His wife left him about a year ago, took their son with her. He's been living with his parents since, doing odd jobs when he can find them. I think some of what you saw at the hospital was just bitterness at how differently things turned out for the two of you." Clara absorbed this information quietly, feeling the same distant pity she had felt earlier rather than any satisfaction in his misfortune. "I don't wish him harm," she said finally. "I just wish he'd understood, all those years ago, that his words could cause so much damage. Maybe if he had, he'd have thought twice about using them so carelessly." "People rarely think about the weight of their words until they're forced to carry similar weight themselves," Louise observed thoughtfully. "Maybe this will teach him something, eventually, even if it's a hard lesson to learn." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as the evening continued, Louise sharing stories from her own life, asking eager questions about Clara's career, about how she had met Beau, about the wedding plans taking shape. Beau returned from the backyard eventually, laughing at something Louise's youngest daughter had said, effortlessly warm and comfortable despite being surrounded by strangers in an unfamiliar town. "He's wonderful, Clara," Louise whispered while Beau helped Peter clear the dinner plates. "Truly. I'm so happy for you." "It took a long time to get here," Clara admitted, "but I think everything happened exactly the way it needed to, even the painful parts." As the evening wound down, Louise walked Clara out to the car while Beau said goodbye to Peter and the children. "I know your mother hurt you deeply," Louise said quietly. "But I've watched her these past few years, Clara. She's carried tremendous guilt over what happened. I think losing you taught her more about standing up for the people she loves than anything else could have." "I want to believe that," Clara said honestly. "I'm trying to. That's all any of us can do," Louise said, pulling her into another warm hug. "Try." The following days brought further healing, small moments accumulating into something larger than Clara had dared hope for upon her return. Margaret visited the hospital daily alongside Clara, the two women slowly rebuilding a fragile trust through quiet conversations in the hospital cafeteria, sharing memories neither had spoken of in years. Margaret admitted, during one such conversation, that she had kept every letter Clara sent during her first year away, though Clara had stopped writing after realizing no one ever responded. "I didn't know how to respond," Margaret confessed, tears in her eyes. "I was ashamed of my own silence that night, and every day that passed made it harder to reach out. I told myself you'd reach out when you were ready, but I should have been the one to try first." Clara reached across the small cafeteria table and took her mother's hand, an act of forgiveness more powerful than any words could have conveyed. "We're both trying now," she said simply. "That has to count for something." Even Daniel's demeanor shifted slightly as the days passed, his initial bitterness softening into something quieter and more subdued. He approached Clara alone one afternoon in the hospital hallway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, unable to meet her eyes directly. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice rougher than she remembered. "What I said back then, and what I said when you first arrived, none of it was fair. I was jealous, I think, watching you build something real, while my own life fell apart. That's not an excuse, just an explanation." Clara studied him for a long moment, remembering the confident, mocking young man he had once been, now standing before her diminished and humbled by his own struggles. "Thank you for saying that," she said honestly. "I hope things get easier for you, Daniel. Truly." He nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability of the moment. Before turning and walking away down the hospital hallway, Clara watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of closure settle over her, years of resentment finally beginning to loosen their grip. 3 weeks after their arrival, Dorothy Bennett had improved enough to be moved home, where hospice care could continue in the comfort of the house she had lived in for over 50 years. Clara and Beau extended their stay further, unwilling to leave before spending as much precious time as possible with the grandmother who had always loved her unconditionally. Sitting beside Dorothy's bed one afternoon, the older woman reached for Clara's hand with surprising strength, her eyes clear and focused despite her physical frailty. "I want to see you married before I go, Clara," she said softly. "I know that's a lot to ask, given how little time we might have, but I've waited so long to see you happy, truly happy, and I don't want to miss it." Clara's eyes filled with tears at the request, glancing toward Beau, who had been sitting quietly nearby throughout the conversation. He nodded immediately, understanding without needing further explanation. "We were planning a small ceremony back in Savannah," Clara said, "but there's no reason we couldn't have something small here instead. Something simple, just for family." Word spread quickly once the decision was made, and within days, the entire extended family had mobilized to help arrange a modest wedding in Dorothy's backyard, beneath the same oak tree Clara had climbed as a child. Louise took charge of decorations, stringing simple white lights through the branches and arranging wildflowers in mason jars along makeshift tables. Margaret, eager to make amends in whatever way she could, spent hours in the kitchen preparing food, insisting on cooking every dish herself despite Clara's protests that she didn't need to go to such trouble. Beau's family arrived 2 days before the ceremony, Walter Calloway surprising everyone with his willingness to travel to a small town he had never previously considered worth visiting. He greeted Margaret with unexpected warmth, the two parents finding common ground in their shared desire to see their children happy, despite the complicated history surrounding this particular union. "Your daughter is a remarkable woman," Walter told Margaret during a quiet moment on the back porch. "My son is a fortunate man to have earned her trust." "She built herself into someone remarkable, despite everything," Margaret replied, a mixture of pride and lingering guilt evident in her voice. "I only wish I'd recognized her strength sooner, before she had to leave to discover it on her own." The morning of the wedding arrived clear and warm, sunlight filtering gently through the oak leaves overhead, as guests began arriving in Dorothy's backyard. Clara stood in her childhood bedroom, wearing a simple ivory dress Louise had helped her choose from a small boutique in town, her hands trembling slightly with nervous excitement rather than the fear that had once accompanied thoughts of this town and everyone in it. Louise fastened the final button on the back of Clara's dress, studying her reflection in the mirror with obvious emotion. "You look exactly like the girl I grew up with," Louise said softly. "Except now you're glowing with a kind of confidence I don't think either of us knew you had inside you back then." "I found it somewhere along the way," Clara said, smiling at her reflection. "I think I always had it, actually. It just took leaving everything familiar to discover it." Margaret knocked softly on the bedroom door, entering when Clara called for her to come in. She carried a small wooden box, worn with age, which she placed gently in Clara's hands. "This belonged to your grandmother," Margaret explained. "She wanted you to have it for today." Inside the box, Clara found a delicate pearl bracelet, clearly decades old, along with a small folded note in Dorothy's careful handwriting. The note read simply, "For the granddaughter who taught an old woman that true strength often looks like quiet patience, and that love worth having is always worth waiting for. I love you more than these old words can say." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she read the note, and Margaret gently helped her fasten the bracelet around her wrist, both women sharing a tender moment neither had expected to experience together again after so many years of distance. "I'm proud of you, Clara," Margaret said quietly. "I should have told you that far more often when you were growing up here. I'm telling you now, and I mean it with everything in me." "Thank you, Mom," Clara whispered, embracing her mother tightly. "That means more than you could possibly know." When the ceremony began, Clara walked down a simple aisle formed between rows of folding chairs, her arm linked with her grandmother's, who insisted on walking her granddaughter toward her future despite her frail condition, refusing any assistance beyond Clara's steady arm. The small gathering of family and friends rose to their feet, many wiping away tears at the sight of Clara radiant and confident, walking toward a man who clearly adored every part of who she had become. Bo stood waiting beneath the oak tree, dressed simply despite his family's wealth, his eyes never leaving Clara's face as she approached. When Dorothy placed Clara's hand in his, she squeezed both their hands together with surprising strength. "Take care of each other," Dorothy said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet gathering. "That's all any marriage really requires, when you get right down to it." The ceremony itself was brief and simple, filled with genuine emotion rather than elaborate tradition. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the small crowd erupted into warm applause, Louise crying openly, Margaret clutching Walter's arm as tears streamed down her own face, even Daniel standing quietly near the back of the gathering, clapping along with something that looked almost like genuine happiness for his cousin's transformed life. The reception that followed felt more like a warm family gathering than a formal celebration, guests mingling freely around simple tables laden with homemade food, children chasing each other through the yard while adults shared stories and laughter late into the evening. Clara moved through the crowd on Beau's arm, greeting relatives she had not seen in years, finding genuine warmth in reconnections she had once believed impossible. Late in the evening, as the celebration began winding down, Clara found herself standing alone beneath the oak tree where she had exchanged vows just hours earlier, watching the last golden light of sunset filter through the branches overhead. Beau joined her quietly, wrapping his arm around her waist as they both looked out over the gathering of family members who had once seemed impossibly distant, now laughing and talking together as though years of silence and hurt had never separated them at all. "How does it feel?" Beau asked softly, "coming full circle like this?" Clara considered the question carefully, thinking of that painful evening years earlier, the mockery, the silence, the desperate drive away from everything familiar. She thought of the diner where she had first found work, the woman who had shown her kindness at a gas station, the real estate career built from nothing but determination, and finally, the man standing beside her now, who had shown her what genuine love and respect truly looked like. "It feels like everything happened exactly the way it needed to," Clara said finally. "Every painful moment led me here, to this exact place, surrounded by people who love me for who I truly am, not for what they expect me to be." Dorothy Bennett passed away peacefully 3 months later, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see her granddaughter married and genuinely happy, a gift Clara would treasure for the rest of her life. At the funeral, Clara delivered a eulogy that spoke not just of her grandmother's kindness, but of the lesson Dorothy had taught her most clearly, that true strength often looks like quiet patience, and that walking away from what harms you is sometimes the bravest and most loving choice a person can make, both for themselves and for those who eventually learn from witnessing that courage. Daniel eventually found steady work again, slowly rebuilding his life with a humility he had lacked in his younger years. He and Clara maintained a cautious but genuine relationship in the years that followed, neither pretending the past hadn't happened, but both choosing to move forward with something resembling mutual respect. Margaret and Clara's relationship continued healing gradually, built on regular phone calls and visits that neither had believed possible during the years of silence between them. Louise remained one of Clara's closest friends, their bond stronger than ever despite the years and distance that had once separated them. In the months following the wedding, before Dorothy's passing, Clara and Beau divided their time between Savannah and her hometown, wanting to give Dorothy as much time with them as her failing health allowed. During these visits, Clara noticed a quiet shift throughout the extended family, cousins who had once whispered behind her back now genuinely curious about her life, aunts who had once sighed at her unmarried status now asking eager questions about wedding photographs and future plans. At one family gathering held shortly before Dorothy's passing, the same lawn where Daniel had once mocked her so cruelly hosted a very different kind of celebration. A simple afternoon barbecue meant to honor Dorothy while she still had strength to enjoy it. Clara stood near the same folding table where she had once set down her lemonade before walking away in humiliation, and this time, surrounded by relatives who greeted her warmly, by a husband who held her hand proudly in front of everyone, she felt nothing but peace where old wounds had once throbbed painfully. Daniel approached her during that gathering, watching his young son, whom his ex-wife had agreed to let him see more regularly as his life stabilized, chase fireflies near the fence line as evening settled over the yard. "This is a better place now," he said quietly, gesturing vaguely at the gathered family. "Feels different than it used to." "People change," Clara said simply. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment to remind us how." He nodded, watching his son laugh in the fading light. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "For him, mostly. But maybe for myself, too." "That's a good place to start," Clara replied. And for the first time since her return, she felt no lingering bitterness toward the cousin who had once driven her away, only quiet hope that he might find his own version of the peace she had discovered. Dorothy's funeral, when it came, drew a larger crowd than anyone expected, testament to the quiet impact she had made throughout her long life in the small community. Clara stood at the front of the small church, her hand steady despite her grief, and delivered words she had carefully prepared in the days following her grandmother's passing. She spoke of childhood afternoons in Dorothy's kitchen, of warm bread and patient wisdom, of the woman who had never once questioned Clara's worth even when the rest of the family had. She spoke of the note Dorothy had left with the pearl bracelet, of the lesson about strength looking like quiet patience, and she closed with words that settled over the gathered mourners like a gentle blessing. "My grandmother taught me that walking away from what hurts you isn't running," Clara said, her voice steady despite her tears. "It's choosing yourself, so that one day you can return, not as the person who was broken, but as the person who healed. I carry that lesson with me every single day, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." After the funeral, family and friends gathered once more beneath the oak tree in Dorothy's backyard, sharing stories and quiet laughter even amid their grief, a celebration of a life well lived rather than only mourning for its ending. Margaret stood beside Clara throughout the gathering, their earlier fragile reconciliation now grown into something steadier and more genuine, built through months of honest conversation and patient rebuilding. In the years that followed, Clara and Beau built a life that honored everything they had both overcome, expanding their restoration business to include projects in Clara's hometown, breathing new life into buildings that had stood neglected for years, much as Clara herself had once been overlooked before finding her own path toward renewal. They welcomed a daughter 3 years after their wedding, naming her Dorothy in honor of the grandmother whose love had never wavered, whose final wish had been simply to see Clara happy. Louise remained a constant presence in their lives, her children growing up alongside Clara and Beau's daughter, the friendship between the two women deepening with each passing year rather than fading as so many childhood friendships eventually do. Margaret became a devoted grandmother, present for every birthday and holiday, determined never again to let fear or silence keep her from the family she cherished. Clara and Beau returned often to the small town where it all began, no longer as strangers or as the subjects of cruel gossip, but as respected members of a family finally healed from years of quiet hurt and misunderstanding. The oak tree in Dorothy's backyard remained a favorite gathering spot, host to countless family celebrations in the years that followed, a living reminder of the day Clara Bennett finally returned home, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply because she was ready, and because everything she needed had finally found its way into her life, standing steadily beside her through every difficult and beautiful moment that followed. 10 years after that painful evening on her family's lawn, Clara stood once again beneath the same oak tree, watching her 7-year-old daughter chase fireflies through the grass with her cousins, laughter ringing bright and unguarded through the warm summer evening. So much had changed since that night Daniel's mockery had sent her fleeing into an uncertain future, and yet the tree itself remained the same steady presence it had always been, its branches now shading a very different kind of gathering. Beau approached from the house, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, handing one to Clara before wrapping his free arm gently around her waist. Nearly a decade of marriage had only deepened the quiet devotion between them, the easy partnership built not on grand gestures, but on the accumulated weight of countless small kindnesses shared over years together. "Your mother tells me little Dorothy has been begging to hear the story again," Beau said, smiling as he watched their daughter dart between the fireflies, her dark curls bouncing with each excited movement. "Which story?" Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. The one about the woman who left everything behind to find herself, and came back stronger than anyone imagined possible, Bo said. Your mother's become quite the storyteller these past few years. Clara laughed softly, watching Margaret sit on the porch steps, gesturing animatedly, as she told the tale to a cluster of grandchildren gathered around her feet. It had become something of a family legend over the years, softened and reshaped through repeated tellings, though Clara knew the truth remained more complicated than any simplified version could fully capture. I never imagined this, Clara admitted, leaning into Bo's shoulder as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Not the mockery that started it all, and honestly, not this either. Not this kind of peace. I think that's often how the best things in life arrive, Bo said thoughtfully. Not through careful planning, but through the courage to walk away from what hurts us, and the patience to wait for something better to find its way to us. Louise joined them a few minutes later, her own children now teenagers, who had grown up treating Clara's daughter like a beloved younger cousin, rather than a distant relative. She carried a photo album, worn at the edges from years of handling, filled with pictures spanning the entire journey from Clara's return to the present moment. I was just showing Dorothy some old pictures, Louise said, settling onto a nearby bench. She wanted to see what you looked like on your wedding day, right here under this very tree. Clara flipped through the album slowly, pausing at photographs that captured moments she remembered vividly. Her mother's tearful embrace outside the hospital room, Daniel's quiet apology in the hospital hallway, the simple ceremony beneath the oak tree with Dorothy walking her down the aisle despite her failing health. Each image told a small piece of a much larger story, one of hurt transformed slowly into healing, of humiliation eventually giving way to genuine, hard-won peace. Daniel arrived later that evening, his son now a teenager himself, tall and confident in ways that reminded Clara faintly of the young man Daniel had once been, before bitterness and failure had worn him down. Daniel had remarried 2 years earlier, a quiet, kind woman named Nora who worked as a schoolteacher in town, and their relationship had brought a steadiness to his life that had been missing for years. Good turnout tonight, Daniel said, settling into a nearby chair, as the evening gathering continued around them. Your mother really does love hosting these things. She's made up for a lot of lost time, Clara said, watching Margaret continue her storytelling on the porch steps, surrounded now by an even larger cluster of curious young relatives. We all have, I think, Daniel said quietly, in our own ways. The years had softened whatever tension once existed between them, replaced by something resembling genuine, if imperfect, family affection. Daniel had never fully articulated the depth of his regret over that painful evening years earlier, but his actions in the years since, his quiet apologies, his efforts to rebuild his own life with humility rather than bitterness, spoke clearly enough without requiring further words. As the evening deepened into night, string lights strung through the oak tree's branches flickered on, casting warm golden light across the gathered family below. Children continued chasing fireflies, while adults settled into comfortable conversation, the easy rhythm of a family finally at peace with itself, after years of quiet fracture and slow, patient repair. Clara found herself standing alone for a moment near the edge of the gathering, watching the scene unfold with a sense of quiet wonder. She thought of the frightened young woman who had once packed 2 suitcases in the middle of the night, fleeing this very town without a single word of explanation to anyone she loved. She thought of the diner where she had first found unexpected kindness, the small real estate office that had given her a chance to prove herself, the restoration project that had brought Bo into her life at exactly the moment she needed him most. She thought too of her grandmother, gone now for several years but never truly absent from these gatherings, her spirit woven into every corner of the yard she had tended so carefully throughout her long life. The pearl bracelet Dorothy had given her on her wedding day still rested safely in Clara's jewelry box, brought out each year on the anniversary of that ceremony beneath the oak tree, a quiet reminder of the lessons Dorothy had passed down through her final gift. Bo found her there, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, as he had done so many times over the years, resting his chin softly against the top of her head, while they both watched their daughter's laughter ring out across the darkening yard. What are you thinking about? He asked quietly. Everything, Clara said honestly. How far we've all come. How something that felt like the end of everything turned out to be the beginning of something so much better. Regret nothing, Bo murmured against her hair. Every difficult step led exactly here, to this moment, to this family, to this peace you've built with your own 2 hands and an unbreakable spirit. Clara turned in his arms to face him fully, studying the warmth in his eyes that had never once wavered since the day they first met among those crumbling buildings so many years earlier. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in me, before I fully believed in myself. Thank you, Bo replied, for teaching me what real strength looks like, and for letting me stand beside you while you built this beautiful life. As the evening wound down and the last of the fireflies blinked out across the darkened yard, Clara gathered her daughter into her arms, carrying her sleepy weight toward the porch where the rest of the family had begun settling in for the night. She paused once more beneath the great oak tree, looking up through its branches at the scattered stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, feeling a profound and settled gratitude for every painful step that had eventually led her back to this exact place, whole and healed, and surrounded by the family she had once believed lost to her forever. The mockery that had once driven her away had long since faded into a distant, almost unrecognizable memory, replaced instead by countless moments of genuine connection, hard-won forgiveness, and steady, unwavering love. Clara Bennett had left this town as a woman, running from humiliation, uncertain of her own worth, desperate to prove herself to people who had never truly seen her clearly. She returned, years later, as a woman who needed to prove nothing at all, secure in her own quiet strength, surrounded finally by a family, and a love that had always been worth the long, difficult journey home.